The heavy oak doors of courtroom 4B didn't just separate the hallway from the bench, they separated two entirely different realities. On the left side sat a man in a bespoke charcoal suit, checking his Rolex with a smirk that screamed he had already won. Beside him, a younger woman whispered something that made them both chuckle, her diamond bracelet catching the harsh, fluorescent light. On the right side, empty chairs. Silence. Everyone, including the stenographer, expected a default judgment. But when the doors finally groaned open, the air in the room didn't just shift, it froze. It wasn't a lawyer who walked in. It was a woman in a faded coat, pushing a battered double stroller, carrying a secret that was about to shatter that man's arrogant grin into a million irreparable pieces. Rain battered the single-pane window of the Motel 6 off I-95, a relentless rhythm that matched the pounding headache behind Margaret's eyes. It was 6 a.m. The hearing was at 9 hours. She sat on the edge of the sagging mattress, staring at her reflection in the cracked mirror opposite the bed. The woman looking back was a ghost of the one who had hosted charity galas in Manhattan just 2 years ago. Her blonde hair, once glossy and professionally blown out, was pulled back into a fraying, messy bun. Dark circles, purple and bruised-looking, sat heavy under eyes that had run out of tears weeks ago. In the crib provided by the motel, a metal cage on wheels that smelled faintly of disinfectant and stale cigarettes, the twins, Leo and Sonia, were finally sleeping. They were only 3 months old, 3 months of colic, 3 months of sleepless nights, and 3 months of hiding. "We have to go, Maddie," she whispered to herself, her voice raspy. "We have to go face him." She stood up, her knees popping. Every movement felt like wading through molasses. She walked over to the small kitchenette area, where a half-empty can of formula sat next to a stack of legal papers. The papers were damp from the humidity in the room. They detailed the dissolution of her marriage to Ryland Sterling, CEO of Sterling Dynamics, a man who had been named Innovator of the Year by Forbes and the Devil Incarnate by Margaret. Ryland had cut her off 6 months ago. Completely. No credit cards, no access to the joint accounts, no entry to their penthouse in Tribeca. He had claimed she was mentally unstable, a narrative he had carefully crafted with the help of his PR team and his shark of a lawyer, Bertram Cole. He didn't know she was pregnant when he kicked her out. She had found out 3 days later, shivering in a women's shelter in Queens. She had tried to tell him. She had called his office, his cell, even his mother. But Rylan had blocked her number, and his assistant, a woman named Janice, who used to drink tea with Margaret in the afternoons, had icily informed her that Mr. Sterling was not to be disturbed by harassment. So Margaret ran. She ran because Rylan had threatened to have her committed if she didn't sign the divorce papers quietly. She ran to protect the 2 heartbeats she had seen on the ultrasound. But today, the running stopped. Today was the final hearing. If she didn't show up, Rylan would get everything by default, and he would likely use his resources to hunt her down and take the children once he found out they existed. She couldn't let that happen. She dressed the twins in the only clean matching outfits they had, white onesies with little yellow ducks. She put on her own armor, a black dress she had bought at a thrift store for $12, and the wool coat that was missing a button. It was the only remnant of her old life she hadn't pawned for food or diaper money. As she wrestled the heavy double stroller down the motel stairs, the elevator was broken again. A text popped up on her burner phone. It was from her sister, Chloe, the only person who knew where she was. "Good luck, Mads. Remember what we found. Use it. Love you." Margaret gripped the phone tight. The evidence, it was a long shot, a desperate Hail Mary pass in a game where the referee was bought and paid for. But it was all she had. The atmosphere in courtroom 4B was stifling. It smelled of floor wax and old wood, a scent that usually commanded respect, but today just felt oppressive. Ryland Sterling sat at the plaintiff's table, radiating an aura of bored superiority. He adjusted his silk tie, leaning over to whisper to Courtney, who was seated directly behind him in the gallery, technically not allowed at the table but present nonetheless. Courtney was 24, a brand ambassador for a luxury vodka company, and the reason Margaret was currently living in a motel. "Is this going to take long, Rylan?" Courtney sighed, checking her reflection in her phone screen. "We have that lunch reservation at Le Bernardin at 12. "Relax, babe," Ryland soothed, his voice smooth like expensive scotch. "Cole says she won't show. She's probably halfway to Ohio by now. We'll get the default judgment. The assets will be unfrozen, and by noon I'll be a free man." Bertram Cole, Ryland's lawyer, was a man who looked like he was carved out of granite and lacked a soul. He was organizing his files with military precision. "Don't get cocky, Rylan. The judge is Pellington. He's a stickler for procedure. If she shows, it gets messy." Ryland scoffed. "She has no money, Bert, no lawyer, no spine. I broke that years ago." Judge Pellington entered the room, his black robes billowing. He was an older man with steel grey hair and eyes that had seen every variation of human deceit. He took his seat, the gavel banging once, sharp and final. "Docket number 4492. Sterling versus Sterling," the bailiff announced. Judge Pellington looked over his spectacles at the empty defense table. "Mr. Cole, I see the respondent is not present." "No, Your Honor." Cole stood up, buttoning his jacket. "Mrs. Sterling has been served properly. We have proof of receipt. Her absence today is just further proof of her instability and lack of regard for this court's time." "Is that so?" Pellington asked, raising an eyebrow. "Or perhaps she simply couldn't afford the cab fare to get here, considering the financial freeze your client placed on all marital assets?" Cole didn't flinch. "My client was protecting the estate from dissipation, Your Honor. Mrs. Sterling has a history of erratic spending." "Very well," Pellington sighed, opening the file. "If there is no appearance by the respondent by 9:15, I will rule on the motion for default judgment." Rylan grinned at Courtney. It was 9:12. 3 minutes. The seconds ticked by on the large analog clock on the wall. Tick, tick, tick. Rylan began to mentally calculate the value of the stock options he was about to retain solely. Millions. He thought about the house in the Hamptons. His. The art collection. His 914. "Well," Judge Pellington said, reaching for his stamp, "it appears—" Boom! The courtroom doors didn't just open. They hit the back stops with a dull thud. Every head in the room swiveled. Rylan turned, an annoyed expression on his face, expecting a lost intern or a delivery person. Instead, he saw Margaret. She looked thinner than he remembered. Her cheekbones were sharper, her skin paler. But her eyes were blazing with a fire he hadn't seen since they were college students arguing about philosophy. And she wasn't alone. She was pushing a stroller, a wide, clunky, double stroller. The silence that followed was absolute. The only sound was the squeak of the stroller's left wheel as Margaret marched down the center aisle. Squeak, squeak, squeak. She didn't look at Rylan. She didn't look at Courtney, whose mouth had dropped open in an unappealing, "Oh." She looked straight at Judge Pellington. She parked the stroller next to the defense table. She reached down, unbuckled 2 straps, and lifted 2 bundles. She held one baby in her left arm and one in her right, balancing them on her hips with a practiced ease that shocked Rylan. The babies were awake now, their wide blue eyes scanning the strange room. They looked exactly like Rylan. The same nose, the same chin. "I apologize for my tardiness, Your Honor," Margaret said, her voice clear and steady, betraying none of the fear churning in her stomach. The subway elevator was out, and I had to carry the stroller up 3 flights of stairs. Judge Pellington stared at the babies. Then he looked at Rylan, then back at Margaret. "Mrs. Sterling," the judge said softly, "you have brought children into my courtroom." "I had no choice, Your Honor," Margaret said. "I can't afford a babysitter. In fact, I can barely afford the diapers they are wearing. But I am here, and I am contesting this divorce." "Objection!" Cole barked, jumping up, though he looked visibly shaken. "This is a stunt. Bringing infants into a courtroom is highly irregular and—" "Sit down, Mr. Cole," Pellington snapped, his voice cracking like a whip. "The irregularity here seems to be far more complex than a mother bringing her children to court." Rylan was gripping the edge of the table so hard his knuckles were white. He stared at the twins. He did the math. The last time he had touched Margaret was— yes, the timeline fit. "They're yours, Rylan," Margaret said, finally turning to face him. She didn't shout, she didn't scream, she just stated it as a cold, hard fact. "Meet Leo and Sonia, your son and daughter." Courtney let out a high-pitched, incredulous laugh. "You've got to be kidding me. She probably picked those up at a daycare on the way here. Rylan, tell them she's lying." Rylan didn't speak. He couldn't. He was staring at the boy, Leo. The baby had a small birthmark on his earlobe, a small, crescent-shaped mark. Rylan had the exact same mark. "Order!" Pellington banged the gavel. "Miss Courtney, one more outburst and you will be removed. Mrs. Sterling, please take a seat. Do you have legal representation?" Margaret sat, juggling the babies. "No, Your Honor. I am representing myself." "That is ill-advised," Pellington noted, his eyes narrowing at Rylan. "Especially given the new developments." "I have no money for a lawyer, Your Honor," Margaret said, smoothing the blanket over Sonia's legs. "Because my husband emptied our joint accounts the day he filed. I have $42 in my pocket." "He didn't know about the children," Cole interjected quickly, trying to regain control of the narrative. "If Mr. Sterling had known—" "I told him," Margaret cut in. "I tried to tell him. I sent emails. I called. Janice blocked me. He blocked me. He threw me away like garbage, and he didn't care what he was throwing away with me." "Lies!" Rylan found his voice. It was a roar. "She's lying. I never knew. And how do I even know they're mine? She's been gone for 6 months. She could have been with anyone." The babies started to cry at the sound of his shouting, a thin, wailing harmony that filled the acoustic space of the courtroom. Margaret rocked them gently, whispering shushing sounds. She looked up at Rylan, her eyes cold. "We can do a DNA test, Rylan, right now. I'm sure the court can order one. But deep down, you know." "You saw the ear, didn't you?" Rylan paled. Judge Pellington leaned forward, clasping his hands. "Mr. Cole, we are going to take a recess. 30 minutes. I suggest you use that time to speak with your client. Because if it turns out that Mr. Sterling abandoned his pregnant wife and cut off her financial support, leaving her destitute with twins, the equitable distribution of assets in this divorce is going to look very, very different than what you proposed in your filing." "Your Honor," Cole stammered. 30 minutes, Pellington barked. "And bailiff, please get Mrs. Sterling a chair with arms and see if we can find some water for her." As the judge exited to his chambers, the room erupted into hushed whispers. Rylan turned on his heel, grabbing Cole by the arm and dragging him toward the conference room in the back. Courtney scrambled after them, her high heels clacking frantically. Margaret sat alone at the table, the twins calming down against her chest. She took a deep breath. She had survived the first wave. But she knew Rylan. He was cornered now. And a cornered wolf doesn't surrender. It attacks. She looked down at her phone. Another text from Chloe. "I'm at the bank. I found the safety deposit box key you mentioned in Mum's old jewelry box. I'm going in. Pray for us." Margaret closed her eyes. The secret Rylan was terrified of wasn't just the babies. The babies were the surprise. The secret was something far darker. Something that lived in a ledger Rylan thought he had burned years ago. The door to the conference room slammed shut, but not before Margaret heard Courtney screech. "You told me she was barren, Rylan. You told me she was a dried-up old hag." Margaret smirked. The drama was just beginning. The heavy door to the conference room clicked shut, muffling the chaotic sounds of the courthouse hallway, but it did nothing to silence the explosion happening inside. "You said she was gone," Courtney shrieked, pacing the small room like a caged tiger in Louboutins. She spun on Rylan, her face flushed a blotchy red that clashed with her pristine makeup. "You said she was in a mental facility in Vermont. You said she was unable to care for herself, let alone 2 infants. Rylan, those babies, they look exactly like you. It's disgusting." Rylan Sterling loosened his tie, sweat beading on his forehead, despite the aggressive air conditioning. "Shut up, Courtney. Just shut up for a second." "Don't tell me to shut up," she snapped. "I have a reputation, Rylan. I'm an influencer. If people find out I'm dating a deadbeat dad who left his wife while she was pregnant with twins, my sponsorship with Vola Vodka is toast. They have a morality clause." "Your morality clause is the least of my problems right now," Rylan roared, slamming his hand on the mahogany table. Bertram Cole, the lawyer, stood by the window, staring out at the grey city skyline. He was calm, dangerously so. He turned slowly. "Rylan, sit down. We need to do damage control. Now." Rylan collapsed into a chair, putting his head in his hands. "It's a trick. She's trying to trap me." "It's not a trick," Cole said, his voice cold and analytical. "I saw the boy's ear. I've known you for 20 years, Rylan. That's the Sterling mark. And Pellington saw it too. If we push for a DNA test, we're just delaying the inevitable. And when the results come back positive, Pellington will hang you out to dry for perjury and abandonment." "So what do we do?" Rylan looked up, desperation creeping into his eyes. "We settle," Cole said. "We offer her a lump sum. Cash. Today. In exchange, she signs a full NDA, gives up any claim to the company shares, and we structure a child support arrangement that keeps her quiet and out of the press." "I'm not giving her a dime of the company," Rylan spat. "I built Sterling Dynamics. She just decorated the lobby." "Do you want to keep the company, or do you want to be right?" Cole asked sharply. "Because right now, you look like a monster. And if the press gets wind of the poor wife with twins narrative, your stock price will plummet faster than a lead balloon. The board will oust you by Monday." Rylan gritted his teeth. He knew Cole was right. He hated it, but he knew it. "Fine. Offer her 50,000. Cole laughed, a dry, humorless sound. 50,000. "Rylan, she walked in there with 2 heirs to your fortune. You're going to have to add a 0, maybe 2. Meanwhile, outside in the hallway, Margaret was living a different kind of struggle. She had moved to a wooden bench near the water fountain. Sonia had started to fuss, hungry again. Margaret draped a muslin blanket over her shoulder and began to nurse the baby, using her foot to rock the stroller where Leo was still dozing. Passers-by stared, some with pity, some with judgment. Margaret ignored them all. She was focused on the phone in her lap. "Chloe." "I'm in." The box was dusty, looked like it hadn't been touched in years. "There's a red ledger and a flash drive. I'm heading to an internet cafe to check the drive. Don't sign anything yet." Margaret exhaled, her breath shaky. The red ledger. 3 years ago, Rylan had come home drunk. He had been rambling about offshore diversification and tax havens. He had passed out on the sofa, and a small notebook had fallen out of his jacket pocket. Margaret, cleaning up after him as usual, had picked it up. She had peeked inside. It was full of account numbers and names of shell companies. She hadn't understood it then, but she had taken a picture of one page before putting it back. When things got bad, when the emotional abuse started, when he began gaslighting her. She had mentioned the notebook. Rylan's reaction had been terrifying. He had turned white, then violent. He told her she was crazy, that no such book existed. That was the beginning of his campaign to paint her as mentally unstable. But she knew it was real. And if Chloe had it, she had the smoking gun. Margaret. She froze. She knew that voice. She looked up to see Rylan standing over her. He had composed himself, smoothed his hair, and put his CEO face back on. But his eyes were darting around nervously. "Rylan," she said quietly, not breaking her rhythm of rocking the stroller. "Look at you," he sneered, though he kept his voice low. "You look like a homeless person. Is this how you're raising my children?" "Our children," she corrected. "And yes, this is how I'm raising them. Because you froze the accounts, remember? You cancelled the health insurance. Leo had an ear infection last month. I had to sell my engagement ring to pay for the antibiotics." Rylan flinched, but quickly covered it. "I'm willing to be generous, Maddie, despite the stunt you pulled in there." "Generous?" She raised an eyebrow. "Bertram is drafting an agreement right now, a check, for $100,000. Immediate wire transfer. You can get an apartment, get whatever this is cleaned up." He gestured vaguely at her and the babies. "All you have to do is drop the contestation, sign the papers, and agree to a private custody arrangement." "And the company?" Margaret asked. "What about my share of Sterling Dynamics? I worked there for 5 years, Rylan. I helped you write the business plan." "Don't be greedy," he hissed, leaning in closer. "You get the cash or you get nothing. You have no lawyer. You have no resources. You think Pellington is going to hand over my business to a woman living in a motel? I'll bury you in legal fees for the next decade. The kids will be in college before you see a penny." Margaret looked at him, really looked at him. She saw the fear behind the arrogance. "No," she said. Rylan blinked. "Excuse me?" "No," she repeated, her voice gaining strength. "I don't want your hush money. I want what is fair. I want half, Rylan. And I want full custody." "You're insane," he spat. "You really are crazy." "Maybe," she smiled, a cold, dangerous smile he had never seen before. "But I'm not the one who lied to a federal judge about assets." "Am I?" Rylan stiffened. "What are you talking about?" "The red ledger, Rylan," she whispered. "The one in your mother's safety deposit box. The one you thought was safe because she has dementia and doesn't know what day it is." The color drained from Rylan's face so fast, he looked like a corpse. He opened his mouth, but no sound came out. "See you in court," Margaret said, turning her attention back to Sonia. The courtroom was buzzing when the recess ended. Word had spread. Clerks from other courtrooms were finding excuses to walk by the open doors. The poor wife with twins versus the millionaire CEO was the midday soap opera everyone wanted to watch. Judge Pellington swept back in, looking even more stern than before. "Be seated." Bertram Cole stood up, looking slightly disheveled. "Your Honor, during the recess, we attempted to reach a settlement with Mrs. Sterling to avoid further theatrics. Unfortunately, she refused a very generous offer." "I'm sure she did," Pellington said dryly. "Now, let's address the elephant in the room. Or rather, The 2 infants. Mr. Cole, does your client concede paternity? Cole hesitated. He looked at Rylan, who was staring blankly at the table, his hands trembling slightly. At this time, Your Honor, we would still request a formal DNA test for the record. However, my client is willing to provide interim support pending those results. How big of a heart you have, Pellington scoffed. Mrs. Sterling, you are representing yourself. You have the floor. What is your response to the request for a DNA test? Margaret stood up. Sonia was now asleep in the stroller next to Leo. Margaret adjusted her coat. She felt a vibration in her pocket. She glanced down surreptitiously. Chloe sent a photo. Margaret clicked it open. It was a screenshot of a spreadsheet. At the top it read, Project Gemini. Account holder, Courtney Vance. Rylan Sterling. Margaret's eyes widened. She looked at Courtney, who was sitting in the gallery, aggressively typing on her phone, looking bored and annoyed. Project Gemini. The irony wasn't lost on her. Twins. Your Honor, Margaret said, her voice ringing out clear and true. I have no objection to a DNA test. In fact, I welcome it. But I have a more pressing matter regarding the division of assets. Proceed. Pellington nodded. Mr. Sterling claims his net worth is approximately $4 million, mostly tied up in company stock and the marital home, Margaret said, referencing the papers she had memorized over the last sleepless nights. That is correct, Cole interjected. Financial disclosures have been filed. Those disclosures are fraudulent, Margaret stated. A gasp went through the gallery. Objection, Cole shouted. That is a serious accusation without proof. I have proof, Margaret said. She walked toward the bench, holding up her phone. My sister has just accessed a flash drive that was stored in a safety deposit box belonging to Mr. Sterling's mother. It details a series of offshore accounts in the Cayman Islands under the shell company Sea Venture. Rylan jumped up, knocking his chair over. That's illegal. She stole that. That's inadmissible. Sit down, Mr. Sterling, Pellington roared, or I will have you in contempt. Rylan sank back down, but his eyes were wild. He looked at Courtney. Courtney looked confused. Sea Venture, she whispered loud enough for the front row to hear. That's the name of my LLC. The courtroom went deadly silent. Margaret turned to the gallery. She looked directly at Courtney. Yes, Courtney, it is. Did you know that Rylan moved $12 million of marital assets into your LLC 3 weeks before he filed for divorce? Courtney dropped her phone. It clattered loudly on the wooden floor. What? Courtney stammered. No, he handles the finances. I just signed the papers for the vodka brand. $12 million, Margaret continued, turning back to the judge. Hidden under his mistress's name to hide it from his wife and children. He made her an accomplice to tax fraud and embezzlement. That's a lie, Rylan screamed, his composure completely shattering. She knew. She signed everything. It was her idea. The courtroom erupted. Courtney let out a sound that was half scream, half sob. She leaped up from her seat, rushing toward the railing that separated the gallery from the court floor. You liar! You told me that money was for the expansion. You told me it was clean. I'm not going to jail for you. Order! Order! Pellington was banging the gavel furiously, but the chaos was unstoppable. You set me up! Courtney yelled, pointing a manicured finger at Rylan. Her influencer mask melted away, revealing a terrified 24-year-old girl who realized she had been played. Judge, I have the emails. He sent me the documents to sign. He said it was tax optimization for my brand. I didn't know he was stealing from her. Bertram Cole, realizing the ship was sinking and on fire, began slowly packing his briefcase. He knew when a case was lost. This wasn't just lost. It was a criminal indictment waiting to happen. Judge Pellington's face was a mask of fury. "Bailiff, secure the courtroom. Mr. Sterling, sit down and shut up before I have you shackled." The bailiff moved between Rylan and the gallery, blocking Courtney, who was now crying hysterically, mascara running down her face in black rivers. "Mrs. Sterling," Judge Pellington said, his voice terrifyingly calm amidst the noise. "Please bring that phone to the bench." Margaret walked forward. She handed her cracked, cheap smartphone to the judge. He adjusted his glasses and looked at the image Chloe had sent. He scrolled. He zoomed in. He looked up at Rylan. The look was one of pure disgust. "Mr. Cole," Pellington said, "it appears your client has not only committed perjury on his financial affidavit, but has also implicated a third party in a massive scheme to defraud this court. I was unaware of these assets, Your Honor," Cole said, distancing himself immediately. "If this is true, I will be moving to withdraw as counsel." "You can't quit!" Rylan shrieked. "I pay you." "Not with that money, you don't," Cole snapped. "I want a forensic accountant appointed immediately," Pellington ordered, his voice booming. "All assets belonging to Mr. Sterling, Sterling Dynamics, and this Sea Venture are frozen effective immediately. Passports are to be surrendered. Mr. Sterling, you are not to leave the state of New York." Then the judge looked at Margaret. His expression softened. "Mrs. Sterling, it seems we have a lot of unraveling to do. But for today, I am issuing an emergency temporary order." Margaret held her breath. "Mr. Sterling is ordered to pay emergency spousal and child support in the amount of—" Pellington paused, looking at Rylan with a vindictive glint in his eye. $20,000 per month, effective today. The first payment is due by 5:00 p.m., or a warrant will be issued for his arrest." Rylan slumped forward, his head hitting the table. "Furthermore," Pellington continued, "I am granting Mrs. Sterling exclusive use and occupancy of the Tribeca residence. Mr. Sterling, you have 2 hours to vacate the premises. You may take your clothes and personal toiletries. Everything else stays." "But Courtney lives there," Rylan moaned into the table. Courtney, who was being handed a tissue by a sympathetic security guard, looked up. "Not anymore, you psychopath. I'm calling the FBI. I'm telling them everything." Margaret felt a wave of dizziness. It was relief. Pure, unadulterated relief. "Thank you, Your Honor," she whispered. "Don't thank me yet," Pellington said grimly. "This is just the beginning. But you won't be sleeping in a motel tonight." As the proceedings adjourned, the chaos in the room didn't subside. Reporters who had caught wind of the commotion were trying to push through the doors. Margaret turned to gather her children. She buckled the straps. She checked their diapers. They were calm, oblivious to the fact that their mother had just toppled a giant. As she pushed the stroller toward the aisle, she had to pass Rylan. He was still sitting there, shell-shocked. He looked up at her. His eyes were red. "You ruined me," he whispered. "I built everything, and you ruined it." Margaret stopped. She looked down at him, then at the 2 babies in the stroller. "You built a house of cards, Rylan," she said softly. "I just opened the door to let the wind in." She walked past him. Courtney was near the exit, sobbing into her phone, presumably to her own lawyer. When she saw Margaret, she stopped crying for a second. The 2 women locked eyes. There was no triumph in Margaret's face, only exhaustion. Courtney looked away, ashamed. Margaret pushed the heavy doors open. The hallway was bright. Flashbulbs went off immediately. "Mrs. Sterling! Mrs. Sterling! Is it true your husband hid millions? Mrs. Sterling, are those the secret twins? How do you feel?" Margaret didn't stop. She didn't smile for the cameras. She just kept walking, pushing the stroller toward the elevator that was finally working. She had a home to go to. She had a sister to call. And for the first time in 6 months, she wasn't afraid. The elevator ride up to the 45th floor of the Tribeca Tower was silent, a stark contrast to the cacophony of the courthouse. The golden numbers above the door ticked upward, 10, 20, 30, counting down the moments until Margaret stepped back into her old life. Beside her, Chloe held the stroller handle with a white-knuckled grip. "Are you ready for this? It's going to be weird." "I don't care if it's weird," Margaret said, her voice hollow. "I just care that there's a crib that meets safety standards and a bathtub that doesn't have rust stains." The doors slid open with a soft ding. The penthouse foyer was exactly as she had left it, yet entirely different. The marble floors still gleamed under the crystal chandelier, but the air felt stale, smelling faintly of a perfume Margaret didn't wear. Something floral and overpowering. Courtney's scent. Margaret stepped inside, the click of her worn boot heels echoing in the cavernous space. "Welcome home, Mrs. Sterling," a warm, gravelly voice said. Margaret turned to see Henry, the building's superintendent, standing by the service entrance. He was holding a large box of groceries. Henry had been there the night Rylan kicked her out. He had looked away then, ashamed, unable to stop the man who signed his paychecks. Now his eyes were wet. "I saw the news, Ma'am," Henry said, his voice thick. "I brought up some milk, eggs, and, well, I didn't know what diapers you use, so I got the ones my granddaughter wears." Margaret felt the first crack in her armor. She walked over and hugged the older man. "Thank you, Henry. Thank you." "Mr. Sterling, he called the front desk about 10 minutes ago," Henry whispered, glancing at the door. "He was screaming. Wanted to know if you were here. I told him the locks have already been changed, per the court order. I told him if he steps foot on the property, I'm calling the precinct." "Good," Margaret said, straightening up. "Don't let him in, Henry. Not for anything." As Henry left, Margaret and Chloe pushed the stroller into the living room. The floor-to-ceiling windows offered a panoramic view of Manhattan, the city lights just beginning to twinkle in the twilight. It was a view worth millions, but right now, it just looked cold. The living room was a testament to Courtney's tenure. The elegant beige sofas Margaret had chosen were covered in bright, tacky pink throw pillows. Fashion magazines were scattered across the coffee table, alongside empty bottles of champagne. It looked like a sorority house had exploded inside a museum. "Look at this," Chloe said, picking up a framed photo from the mantel. It used to be a picture of Margaret and Rylan on their honeymoon in Tuscany. Now, it was a photo of Rylan and Courtney on a yacht, laughing, holding glasses of vodka. Chloe smashed the frame face down on the table. Trash. Margaret didn't have the energy for anger. She went straight to the nursery, or what should have been a guest room. She had never set up a nursery because Rylan hadn't wanted kids. "We sleep in the master tonight," Margaret said. "The twins can sleep in the middle of the king bed with pillows around them until we get cribs delivered tomorrow." They walked into the master bedroom. This room was the hardest. This was where she had told Rylan she thought she might be pregnant, the first time, years ago. He had laughed it off. Margaret walked to the walk-in closet. She needed to see if her clothes were still there. She pushed open the double doors. Her side of the closet was empty, stripped bare. "He threw them out," Margaret whispered. "All of it. My wedding dress, my mother's vintage coats, everything. In their place hung rows of sequined mini-dresses, fur coats, and designer jeans in a size 0. "I'm going to burn it all," Chloe said, grabbing a handful of hangers. We're having a bonfire on the terrace." "No," Margaret said, stopping her. "We're not burning anything. We're cataloguing it, every single item, because every dollar he spent on this—" She touched a silk Gucci blouse. "Is a dollar he stole from our family assets. This is evidence." Suddenly the intercom buzzed aggressively. "Bizist. Bizizete." Margaret froze. She looked at the monitor on the wall. It was the front desk. "Mrs. Sterling." It was the night concierge. "I'm sorry to disturb you, but there is a Ms. Courtney Webb here. She says she needs to retrieve her personal items. She's quite hysterical." Margaret looked at Chloe. Chloe shook her head vigorously. "No way." Margaret pressed the talk button. "Tell her to leave." I tried, Mum. She says she has information. She says she wants to make a trade." Margaret's finger hovered over the button. "A trade? Let her up," Margaret said. "Are you crazy?" Chloe hissed. "She's the enemy." "No," Margaret said, her eyes darkening. "She's a loose end, and loose ends can strangle you if you don't tie them up." 3 minutes later, Courtney Webb stood in the foyer. She looked nothing like the polished influencer from the courtroom. Her mascara was smeared, her hair was frizzy, and she was wearing a tracksuit and sneakers. She looked like a college student who had just pulled an all-nighter during finals week. She wasn't carrying a weapon. She was carrying a Whole Foods bag. "I didn't think you'd let me in," Courtney said, her voice trembling. She refused to make eye contact with Margaret, staring instead at the floor. "You have 5 minutes," Margaret said, crossing her arms. "Start talking." Courtney looked up, her eyes red. "I really didn't know about the babies. I swear to God. Rylan told me you were sterile. He told me that you had a breakdown and left him. He said the money was his, that he earned it before he met you." "Ignorance isn't a defense in tax fraud, Courtney," Margaret said coldly. "You signed the papers for Sea Venture. You're the CEO on paper. When the IRS comes, they're coming for you." "I know," Courtney burst into tears. "I know. My lawyer said I'm looking at 5 to 10 years. I can't go to prison, Margaret. I can't. I have a toy poodle. I have a gluten intolerance." Chloe snorted from the doorway. "Priorities." Courtney sniffled, wiping her nose on her sleeve. "That's why I'm here. Rylan. He called me. After he left the court. He's panicked. He's not going to pay the support. He's not going to stay in New York." Margaret stiffened. The judge took his passport. "He has 2, Courtney said. She reached into the Whole Foods bag and pulled out a thick, leather-bound folio. "He has a St. Kitts citizenship. He bought it 3 years ago. Different name. Rylan Stone." Margaret took the folio. She opened it. There it was. A passport with Rylan's face, but a different name. And a stack of cash. Euros. "Why are you giving me this?" Margaret asked. "Because he wants me to bring it to him," Courtney whispered. "He's at the Teterboro Airport private terminal right now. He chartered a jet to the Cayman Islands. It leaves in an hour. He told me if I bring him this passport and the hard drive from the safe in the floor, he'd wire me $1 million once he lands." "The safe in the floor?" Margaret frowned. "We don't have a floor safe." Courtney pointed to the master bedroom. "Under the rug in the closet. He had it installed 6 months ago, right after he kicked you out." Margaret looked at Chloe, then back to Courtney. "And you're betraying him because—" "Because he threw me under the bus!" Courtney shrieked. "He blamed me in court, and because I recorded the call." She pulled out her phone. "I have him on voice memo telling me to bring the fake passport and to burn the rest of the files. If I give this to the FBI, my lawyer says I can get a plea deal. Immunity." Margaret realized then that Courtney wasn't a villain. She was just a shallow, not very bright girl who had gotten caught in the orbit of a narcissist. "Where is the hard drive?" Margaret asked. "I didn't get it," Courtney said. "I don't know the combination. He said it's your birthday, but I tried your birthday. It didn't work." Margaret felt a chill. Rylan was sentimental only when it suited his narrative. If the combination wasn't her birthday, it was something else significant. "Chloe, watch the twins," Margaret said. She turned and ran into the bedroom, flipping on the lights. She dragged the heavy Persian rug aside. There, cut neatly into the subflooring, was a digital safe. "Try the baby's birthday," Chloe called out from the living room. Margaret punched in the numbers. 07 to 12 to 25. Use. Red light. "Try your wedding anniversary," Courtney suggested from the doorway. Margaret tried. 10, 14, 18. Red light. Margaret closed her eyes. She thought about Rylan, the way his mind worked, his arrogance, his obsession with his own success. "The day the company went public," Margaret whispered. It was the day he always said his real life began. She typed in 0309 to 15. Beep. Green light. The lock clicked. Margaret pulled the heavy door open. Inside, there wasn't just a hard drive. There were stacks of cash, $100 bills wrapped in plastic bands, bricks of gold coins, and a small velvet bag. Margaret opened the bag. Diamonds. Loose, uncut diamonds. "Holy," Courtney breathed. He was really planning to run. "He's been planning this for a long time," Margaret said, grabbing the hard drive. "This drive probably has the encryption keys to the offshore accounts. If he leaves with this, or if he leaves with that passport, I'll never see a dime of child support." She stood up, holding the passport and the drive. "We have to call the police," Chloe said. "No time," Margaret said. "Teterboro is 40 minutes away. By the time they get a warrant and mobilize, he'll be in international airspace. St. Kitts doesn't have an extradition treaty for tax evasion." "So what do we do?" Courtney asked. Margaret looked at the mistress. "You're going to go meet him." Courtney's eyes widened. "What? No, he'll kill me." "He won't kill you," Margaret said, her voice hard as steel. "Because you're going to tell him you have the bag. You're going to stall him, and I'm going to be right behind you." "You?" Chloe grabbed Margaret's arm. "Maddie, you have 2 infants. You are not going to an airfield to confront a man who is fleeing the country." "I'm not going alone," Margaret said. She pulled out her phone and dialed a number she had memorized from the business card the judge had given the bailiff earlier. "Who are you calling?" "Detective Miller, the one who was in the courtroom," Margaret said as the line rang. "Rylan thinks he's playing chess. He thinks we're all just pawns. It's time to show him the queen." 45 minutes later, rain slashed sideways across the tarmac. The wind was howling, whipping the rain into a frenzy. A black SUV sat idling near the private hangar. Inside, Rylan Sterling checked his watch for the 50th time. He was sweating. He had already fired the pilot twice for not having the engine started, then rehired him because he was the only one willing to fly in this weather. "Where is she?" he hissed, hitting the steering wheel. His phone buzzed. "Courtney, I'm at the gate. Security is holding me up." "Idiot," Rylan muttered. He rolled down the window and waved his badge at the security guard in the booth. "Let her in. She's with me." The gate opened. A silver Audi pulled through. It was Courtney's car. Rylan breathed a sigh of relief. He stepped out of the SUV, pulling the collar of his trench coat up against the rain. He looked like a villain from a noir film, desperate and cornered. Courtney got out of her car. She was holding the Whole Foods bag. She looked terrified. "Give it to me," Rylan yelled over the roar of the jet engines nearby. "Do you have the drive?" I think so," Courtney shouted back, clutching the bag to her chest. She stopped about 10 feet away from him. "What are you doing? Bring it here." Rylan took a step forward. "Did you really love me?" Courtney yelled. "Or was I just a bank account?" "Are you serious right now?" Rylan screamed, his face contorted with rage. "We are fleeing a federal indictment, Courtney. Get in the damn plane." "Answer me." "No," Rylan roared. "I don't love you. I don't love anyone. I love winning. Now give me the bag." He lunged for her. Courtney screamed and threw the bag at him. Rylan caught it. He tore it open. Inside there was no money, no passport, no hard drive. There was a stack of dirty diapers. Rylan froze. He looked at the contents, then up at Courtney. "What is this?" "That's for the last 6 months," a voice said from the shadows behind the SUV. Rylan spun around. Margaret stepped out from behind the landing gear of the jet. She was wearing her old trench coat, soaked with rain. "Margaret?" Rylan looked like he was hallucinating. "How?" "You underestimated everyone, Rylan," Margaret said, walking closer. "You underestimated Courtney's fear. You underestimated Chloe's loyalty. But mostly, you underestimated a mother's rage." "I have a gun!" Rylan shouted, reaching into his coat. "Drop it!" Floodlights suddenly bathed the tarmac in blinding white light. Sirens wailed, cutting through the sound of the rain. From the hangar doors, a dozen NYPD officers and FBI agents swarmed out, weapons drawn. Detective Miller stood at the front. "Rylan Sterling, hands in the air. Do it now." Rylan looked at the police. He looked at the jet. So close. The stairs were right there. He looked at Margaret. For a second, Margaret saw him calculate the odds. He looked at the gun in his hand. "Don't do it, Rylan," Margaret said softly. "Don't make Leo and Sonia orphans." The mention of their names seemed to snap something in him. His shoulders slumped. The arrogance evaporated, leaving only a small, broken man. He dropped the gun. It clattered on the wet asphalt. "On the ground! Now!" As the officers tackled him, cuffing his hands behind his back, Margaret didn't look away. She watched as they read him his rights. She watched as they pulled the fake passport from his pocket, which Courtney had handed to the detective earlier. Rylan looked up as they dragged him past her. He was crying. "Maddie," he choked out. "Maddie, please, I can fix this, I can—" "Goodbye, Rylan," she said. She turned to Courtney, who was shivering by her car. "You did good," Margaret said. Courtney managed a weak smile. "Does this mean I don't have to go to jail?" "That's up to the judge," Margaret said. "But I'll put in a good word for you." As the police cars sped away, flashing red and blue against the night sky, Margaret looked up at the rain. It felt clean. It felt like a baptism. She took out her phone. There was a text from Chloe. "Babies are asleep. I ordered pizza. Come home." Margaret smiled. She got into the back of the detective's unmarked car to give her statement. The nightmare was over. The story of her life, her real life, was just beginning. The trial of the century, as the New York papers dubbed it, lasted only 3 weeks. With the hard drive from the floor safe and Courtney's damning testimony, the prosecution didn't just have a smoking gun. They had a nuclear weapon. Rylan sat at the defense table, a shell of the arrogant man who had once sneered at Margaret in family court. When the foreman read the verdict, guilty on all counts of fraud, embezzlement and tax evasion, Rylan didn't look at the jury. He looked at Margaret. She met his gaze, her expression unreadable, neither happy nor sad. Just finished. Judge Pellington sentenced Rylan to 15 years in federal prison. Courtney, thanks to her cooperation and Margaret's intervention, received probation and returned to Ohio to study nursing, leaving the influencer life behind forever. But the real story wasn't about the man who lost everything. It was about the woman who rebuilt it all. 1 year later, sunlight flooded the Tribeca penthouse. bouncing off the cream-coloured rugs that had replaced Courtney's tacky pink decor. The air smelled of vanilla and laughter. It was Leo and Sonia's first birthday. Margaret stood in the kitchen, frosting a slightly lopsided dinosaur cake. She wore a tailored silk blouse, a subtle nod to her new reality. After the assets were seized, the board of Sterling Dynamics had done the unthinkable. They asked Margaret to step in. They knew she was the original brains behind the business plan. In 6 months, she had rebranded the company, fired the boys' club executives, and turned the stock price around. The poor wife was now the powerhouse CEO. "The guests are here," Chloe called out, carrying a stack of gifts, the room filled with the people who had become Margaret's true family. Henry the doorman was there in his Sunday best, letting Leo pull on his mustache. Detective Miller, who had arrested Rylan on that rainy tarmac, was awkwardly holding a teddy bear for Sonia. Margaret walked through the party, her heart full. Then she felt a tap on her shoulder. It was Janice, her executive assistant. She looked hesitant. "It came to the office today," Janice whispered, handing Margaret a plain white envelope with a stark prison stamp in the corner. "Rylan Sterling, inmate, 9994422. The room seemed to fade away for a second. Margaret looked at the handwriting. It was shaky, desperate. "Do you want a moment to read it?" Janice asked. "It might be an apology." Margaret looked at the letter, then at her children. Leo was currently smashing a block tower, while Sonia squealed with delight. She thought about the motel room, the cold rain, the fear that had almost consumed her. She realized she didn't care what Rylan had to say. His voice no longer had permission to live in her head. She handed the envelope back to Janice, unopened. "Burn it," Margaret said softly. "You don't want to know?" "I already know everything I need to," Margaret smiled, turning back to her twins. "His chapter is closed. I'm writing a new one." "Cake time!" Chloe shouted. As the room broke into a chaotic, happy rendition of Happy Birthday, Margaret watched Leo smash his fist into the green frosting. She laughed, a sound of pure, unadulterated joy. She wasn't a victim. She wasn't just a survivor. She was a mother, a leader, and for the first time in her life, she was free. This story reminds us that the truth has a way of revealing itself, no matter how deep you bury it under money and lies. Margaret's journey from a desperate mother in a motel room to a powerful woman reclaiming her life proves that resilience is the ultimate revenge. Rylan thought he could discard his family like an old receipt, but he forgot that a cornered mother is the most dangerous force on earth. He built a castle on a foundation of sand, and all it took was one brave woman to bring it all crashing down. Wow, what a roller coaster. I honestly didn't think Courtney would be the one to turn on him in the end. But it just goes to show, there is no honor among thieves. If you enjoyed this story of justice served cold, please hit that like button. It really helps the channel grow and lets me know you want more stories like this. And if you haven't already, subscribe and ring the notification bell so you never miss an upload. What would you have done if you were in Margaret's shoes? Would you have read the letter from prison? Let me know in the comments below. I'll be hearting my favorite answers. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.